The note in the silence. Ava Daniel's voice was like the wind, free, powerful, and impossible to contain. Music was the air she breathed, the rhythm that gave her heart its steady beat. Every note she sang felt like a thread connecting her to her late mother, a singer whose talent was never given the chance to bloom. Ava carried her mother's unfulfilled dreams like a precious inheritance, determined to ensure that her voice would one day fill the grandest halls with melodies too beautiful to ignore. But dreams in Crestville, a town known more for its wealth than its diversity, were not always enough. The town had a reputation for excellence in education, with Rosewood High School at its center, a prestigious institution where the students were as polished as the gleaming marble floors. Despite all the accolades and opportunities, Ava often felt like a stranger, navigating hallways that whispered secrets she was never invited to hear. It wasn't just that she was one of the few black students, it was the unspoken but ever-present feeling that she didn't quite belong. The choir room had been her escape, a sanctuary where music could strip away those invisible walls and leave only the pure sound of voices coming together. It was here that Ava had found herself, her voice a weapon against doubt. Her melodies wrapped around the room, filling every corner, forcing even the most skeptical ears to listen. Today was the day she had been waiting for, the day when Miss Miranda Hodge, the school's strict but revered music teacher, would choose the soloists for the spring showcase. The showcase was the most significant event of the year, and Ava knew that this could be her moment. A chance to show not only her classmates, but the entire town what she was capable of. She arrived early, as always, slipping into the back row of the music room, her sheet music carefully folded in her hands. The room was already buzzing with the sounds of her peers warming up. Ava liked to come early to listen. Hearing the different voices preparing for the same moment gave her a sense of unity, even as she often felt apart from them. Miss Hodge stood at the front, her presence commanding as usual. Her posture was rigid, every line of her body radiating authority. With her silver-streaked hair tied back into a neat bun and sharp, tailored clothes, she looked every bit the classical musician she was rumored to have been. Word around town was that she had once performed in some of the world's finest opera houses before injury forced her off the stage. Now, she poured all that intensity into shaping her students, molding their voices like clay. Ava had always admired Miss Hodge's dedication to the craft, but there was something in the way Miss Hodge looked at her, something cold and distant, as if Ava's presence in her classroom was a disruption rather than a student's right. Miss Hodge began calling on students one by one, her sharp critiques and rare praises filling the room. Ava watched as her peers stood up, performed their pieces, and returned to their seats, some beaming, others with their confidence visibly shaken. Ava's heart beat faster with each name called, the anticipation building like a crescendo in a symphony. Finally, Miss Hodge's eyes fell on her. "Ava," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, "let's get your piece." Ava stood, her legs trembling slightly as she made her way to the front of the room. This was it. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, practicing until her throat was raw and her heart ached with a longing to be perfect. As she took her place at the piano, she glanced at her sheet music, though she barely needed it. She had memorized every note, every rise and fall in the melody. Taking a deep breath, Ava began to sing. Her voice started soft, a gentle hum that built slowly, rising like a tide. With each word, her confidence grew, and soon her voice filled the room, rich and soulful. It was the kind of voice that made people stop and listen, not just to the music, but to the story behind it. Ava's voice was full of the weight of her mother's dreams, her father's hope, and her own burning desire to succeed. It was a voice that carried a lifetime of struggle and resilience, woven into every note. She could feel the energy shift in the room as her classmates sat up straighter, some turning in their seats to watch her more closely. They had heard her sing before, but not like this. Today, she wasn't just singing for herself, she was singing to prove that she belonged, that she was just as worthy of this stage as anyone else. Miss Hodge stood at the piano, her expression unreadable. Ava couldn't help but wonder what the older woman was thinking. Could she feel it? The power in her voice. The years of hard work and passion that had brought her to this moment. Then, just as Ava reached the most challenging part of the song, a high note that soared like a bird in flight, Miss Hodges' hand shot up. "That's enough," she said abruptly. Ava stopped mid-note, her voice trailing off awkwardly into the silence. She blinked, confused. Her heart, which had been soaring just moments before, plummeted. She had barely finished half the piece. "That's enough," Miss Hodge repeated, her voice cold. She turned to the rest of the class. "We'll move on." Ava stood there frozen. She hadn't received any feedback, no critique, no praise, just silence. The class buzzed with confusion, her peers exchanging puzzled glances, but no one dared to say anything. "Ava," Miss Hodge said, looking directly at her now, "opera is a genre that requires more than just a strong voice. It's about control, refinement, and technique. Your voice might be fine for other types of music, but it's not suitable for opera." Ava's breath caught in her throat. "But I've been practicing for..." Miss Hodge raised a hand to silence her. "Practice is important, but talent only gets you so far. Opera isn't something you can just practice your way into. Some voices are suited for it, and some aren't." Ava felt as if the floor had fallen out from beneath her. She had expected critiques, she knew she wasn't perfect. But this felt different. This wasn't about improvement or feedback. This felt like a dismissal. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead her case, but the look on Miss Hodges' face stopped her. It wasn't just disapproval, it was disdain. Miss Hodge turned away, calling on the next student. The conversation was over. Ava's feet felt heavy as she made her way back to her seat. The buzzing in the room grew louder as whispers circulated among her classmates. They avoided her gaze, their eyes darting back to the front of the room as if pretending nothing had happened. But Ava felt it. The weight of every doubt, every whispered word, every barrier she had fought so hard to ignore. It was all there, pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe. As the class went on, Ava sat in silence, her voice trapped in her chest, the melody that had once filled the room now silenced by doubt. When the final bell rang, Ava stayed behind, watching as her classmates filed out, their laughter echoing in the hall. Miss Hodge was gathering her things at the piano, her back turned to Ava. Ava hesitated. She could just leave. Let this go. Accept that maybe opera wasn't for her. But something inside her refused to let her stay silent. She couldn't just walk away from this. She walked up to the piano, her heart pounding. "Miss Hodge," she said quietly. The older woman glanced up, surprised to see her still there. "Can I try again? I know I can do better if..." Miss Hodge shook her head, cutting her off. "Ava, some voices are meant for certain things, and I think you need to accept that opera isn't for you." Ava stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. She wanted to argue, to scream, to make Miss Hodge see that she was wrong. But the woman's expression was so final, so absolute, that the words caught in her throat. With a small nod, Ava turned and left the room, her footsteps heavy as she walked down the empty hallway. But deep down, as her hands clenched into fists at her sides, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done yet. The echoes of doubt. The soft hum of the neighborhood settled around Ava as she walked home, her school bag slung over her shoulder, the weight of Miss Hodges' words pressing down like lead in her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very sidewalk had conspired to slow her down. Her heart thudded dully in her ears, and the buzzing of cars passing by became a distant blur. She could still hear Miss Hodges' voice, cool and dismissive, ringing in her ears. "Opera isn't for you." It wasn't just the rejection that stung, it was the finality of it. Like a door had slammed shut in her face, leaving her on the outside of her own dreams. All her hard work, all the hours spent practicing, felt meaningless. She had heard about setbacks and challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the feeling of having someone so casually strip away her belief in herself. The streets of Crestville were quiet as Ava rounded the corner to her house, the small blue-painted home she shared with her father. The neighborhood was older, with neatly kept lawns and picket fences, but it had never really felt like home. Not after her mother had passed. The house had always been her mother's domain. Jasmine Daniels had filled every room with her laughter, her warmth, and most of all, her voice. Her mother had been a local legend, known for singing at church events and community gatherings. But like so many other dreams deferred, her talent had never gone beyond Crestville. Ava had vowed that she would take her mother's voice to the world, that she would stand on stages her mother had only dreamed of. But now, with Miss Hodges' words still burning in her mind, those dreams seemed farther away than ever. Ava pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The smell of fried chicken and garlic mashed potatoes greeted her, a familiar comfort. Her father, Darius, was at the stove, humming an old blues tune as he stirred a pot of gravy. He looked up as she walked in, his smile fading slightly when he saw her face. "Hey, baby girl," he said, his deep voice filled with concern. "Rough day." Ava dropped her bag by the door and shrugged. "Yeah, you could say that." Darius wiped his hands on a dish towel and gestured toward the kitchen table. "Sit, let's talk." Ava slid into a chair, resting her chin on her hands. She hadn't planned on telling her dad everything, but the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. She told him about the class, about Miss Hodges' dismissal, and how it had felt like a punch to the gut. "She told me opera wasn't for me," Ava said, her voice cracking. "Like I didn't even deserve to try." Darius was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he sat down across from her, his large hands resting on the table. "You know your mama used to face the same thing," he said quietly. "There were people who told her she couldn't make it either, said she wasn't good enough. But she kept singing, no matter what." Ava bit her lip, her throat tightening. "But it's different now, Dad. Mama had people in her corner. She had opportunities. I'm stuck here. And now even my own teacher thinks I'm not good enough." Darius leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Ava, you can't let one person tell you what you're worth. Your voice is a gift, and no one, no teacher, no critic, can take that away from you. I know it's hard, but sometimes you have to fight harder than anyone else. You're gonna face people like Miss Hodge all your life, but you've got something special, and you can't let them silence you." Ava nodded, though doubt still clung to her like a shadow. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her voice was enough, that she was enough. But Miss Hodges' rejection had planted a seed of doubt, and it was growing fast. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ava tried to lose herself in her schoolwork, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the music room, to the cold look in Miss Hodges' eyes as she dismissed her. It was as if she had already made up her mind about Ava before she'd even opened her mouth to sing. Later that night, Ava found herself sitting at her desk, staring at her sheet music. The notes swam before her eyes, blurring together in a sea of ink. Her hands itched to sing, to prove to herself that she still had it. But every time she opened her mouth, the voice that came out sounded flat, hollow, empty. She closed her eyes and let her mind wander back to her mother's voice, so full of life, so effortlessly powerful. Her mother had sung with her heart wide open, never holding back, never letting fear creep in. Jasmine Daniels had been a force of nature, and Ava had always admired that about her. But now, in the silence of her room, Ava felt the weight of her mother's legacy like a mountain on her shoulders. "What if I can't live up to her?" she thought, the question echoing in the quiet. "What if Miss Hodge is right?" The doubt gnawed at her, persistent and unrelenting. Ava had always believed that hard work and talent were enough to get her where she wanted to go. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure. The next few days passed in a haze. Ava went through the motions at school, but her heart wasn't in it. She avoided the music room, opting instead to spend her free periods in the library, where she could disappear into the world of books and forget about the weight of her disappointment. Her friends noticed the change, but Ava shrugged off their concerns, offering vague excuses about being tired or stressed about exams. The truth was, she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to admit how much Miss Hodge's words had hurt her. But the music still called to her, a quiet, insistent melody that refused to be silenced. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, it always found its way back, winding through her thoughts, filling the empty spaces in her mind. One afternoon, after yet another uneventful day at school, Ava found herself standing outside the music room. She hadn't intended to come here, but her feet had carried her there of their own accord. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, she could hear the faint strains of a piano, accompanied by a soft, melodic voice. Ava hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She wasn't sure she was ready to face Miss Hodge again, not after everything that had happened. But something inside her urged her forward, a quiet voice telling her that she couldn't hide forever. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Miss Hodge was at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. Seated beside her was Elena Carter, one of Ava's classmates, her voice soaring as she sang an Italian aria. Elena had always been one of Miss Hodge's favorites, with her perfect posture and classically trained voice. She had the look and sound of someone born to sing opera. Ava watched from the doorway, her heart sinking as she listened. Elena's voice was beautiful, there was no denying that. But it lacked the soul, the fire that Ava's voice carried, and yet Miss Hodge had chosen her. Miss Hodge glanced up and noticed Ava standing there. Her expression was neutral, almost indifferent. She said nothing, simply continued playing as if Ava didn't exist. Ava stood there for a moment longer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The old Ava would have turned and walked away, let the disappointment settle in her bones like a stone, but something had shifted inside her. The weight of her doubt was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new emotion: anger. She wasn't just angry at Miss Hodge. She was angry at herself for letting one person dictate her worth, for allowing her dreams to be so easily dismissed. Ava realized that if she wanted to prove herself, she couldn't wait for someone like Miss Hodge to hand her an opportunity. She would have to take it for herself. Without a word, Ava turned and walked out of the music room, her steps lighter, her heart a little less heavy. The battle wasn't over, but Ava knew one thing for sure: she wasn't done fighting. The fight for the stage. Ava couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in her chest. Days had passed since the confrontation with Miss Hodge, and the sting of rejection still lingered, like an old wound that refused to heal. But something else was bubbling beneath the surface now, something fiercer, more powerful. The sting had given way to anger, and anger had sparked a flame of determination. It wasn't enough for Ava to quietly disappear into the background. She had too much to lose. The music had been her lifeline since her mother passed away, a way to keep her memory alive, a way to dream beyond the limits of Crestville. Giving up on that was never an option, not for her. But how could she fight against someone like Miss Hodge, a teacher whose word carried weight, whose judgment determined who got the spotlight and who didn't? You don't wait for them to hand it to you, Ava thought one night as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. You take it. The thought was simple, but it burned with clarity. Miss Hodge had made up her mind about Ava. It wasn't just about technique, or talent, or hard work. It was about something deeper. Miss Hodge saw Ava as someone who didn't fit the mold, someone who didn't belong in her pristine world of classical music and opera. But that didn't mean Ava couldn't make space for herself. She just had to change the rules. The next morning, Ava woke with a new sense of purpose. She got ready for school faster than usual, her mind racing with ideas. The spring showcase was still weeks away, and though Miss Hodge had already chosen her favorites for the solo performances, nothing was final until the curtain rose. As she stepped into the kitchen, her father was already sitting at the table, sipping his coffee. The scent of breakfast, eggs, bacon, and toast filled the small kitchen, but Ava barely noticed. Her thoughts were too focused on what she needed to do next. "Morning, baby girl," Darius said, looking up from his newspaper. "You're up early." Ava grabbed an apple from the counter, biting into it with more force than necessary. "Yeah, I've got a lot to do." Her father raised an eyebrow. "That's so. Something tells me you're not talking about homework." Ava paused mid-bite, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I've been thinking. Miss Hodge might have shut me out, but that doesn't mean I'm done. There's still the showcase, and I'm not going to let her stop me from performing." Darius set his coffee cup down, his expression serious. "You sure you want to do this, Ava? I know how much this means to you, but going against your teacher might make things harder." Ava met his gaze, her voice steady. "I know it's not going to be easy, Dad, but I can't just sit back and let her decide what I'm capable of. If I don't fight for this, I'll always wonder what could have happened." Darius studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Your mama would be proud of you. You've got that same fire she had." Ava smiled, though her stomach was a knot of nerves. Her father's words were a comfort, but they also reminded her of the weight she carried. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her mother's legacy too. By the time Ava arrived at school, she had a plan. It wasn't foolproof, and it wasn't guaranteed to work, but it was something. And right now, that was enough. She spent the morning in a daze, barely able to focus on her classes. Every free moment was spent scribbling notes in the margins of her notebook, her mind racing with ideas for the performance she would put together on her own. If Miss Hodge wasn't going to give her the spotlight, then Ava would create her own. The spring showcase was always held in the school's auditorium, a grand space with velvet curtains and polished wood floors. It was the kind of stage that made every performer feel like they were standing in the spotlight of a world-class venue. Ava had imagined herself on that stage so many times, her voice soaring to the rafters, the audience enraptured by her performance. But now that dream seemed more distant than ever. Still, Ava wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. After lunch, Ava made her way to the music room. Miss Hodge was leading a rehearsal with the chosen soloists, but Ava waited outside, listening to the muffled sounds of their voices through the door. She recognized the high, lilting voice of Elena Carter, one of the favorites, effortlessly gliding through her aria. Ava clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. Elena's voice was good, sure, but it lacked the depth, the emotion that Ava knew she could bring to the performance. Miss Hodge might have chosen Elena, but Ava wasn't about to let that stop her. When the rehearsal ended, the students filed out of the room, chattering excitedly about their upcoming solos. Elena glanced at Ava as she passed, her expression unreadable. Ava gave her a tight nod in return, then stepped into the room. Miss Hodge was packing up her sheet music when she noticed Ava standing in the doorway. Her face tightened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Ava took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Miss Hodge, I need to talk to you." Miss Hodge glanced up, her eyes narrowing. "I don't have much time, Ava. If this is about the showcase, my decision is final." Ava swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "I'm not asking you to change your decision. I just want a chance to show you that I belong in this performance." Miss Hodge's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already given you feedback, Ava. Opera requires more than just raw talent. You need refinement, control, qualities that I haven't seen in your voice." Ava's heart sank, but she didn't back down. "I know I have more to learn, but you haven't given me a real chance to prove that I can do this. I'm not asking for favoritism, I'm asking for an opportunity." Miss Hodge sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "Ava, you're talented. There's no doubt about that. But opera isn't about singing with emotion alone. It's about discipline. You can't just sing your way into it." Ava's jaw tightened. "I know that. But if you don't let me try, how will I ever get better? How will I know if I'm capable?" Miss Hodge stared at her for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Finally, she straightened and crossed her arms. "You have 3 minutes, Ava. Show me what you've got." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected Miss Hodge to agree. But now that she had, the pressure was even greater. She couldn't mess this up. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned herself in front of the piano. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. This time, Ava didn't hold back. She poured everything she had into the music, every ounce of doubt, every frustration, every dream she had ever held close to her heart. Her voice soared, rich and powerful, filling the room with a melody that carried the weight of her soul. She sang as if it were the last time she would ever sing, as if the world depended on every note. When she finished, the room was silent. Miss Hodge stood still, her expression unreadable. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for a response. For a moment, she thought Miss Hodge might dismiss her again, might tell her that it wasn't enough. But then, something shifted in the older woman's gaze. Miss Hodge set down her music and nodded once, her voice quiet. "You've improved." Ava blinked, barely able to believe her ears. "Does that mean?" "It means you've shown me that you're capable of more than I initially thought," Miss Hodge said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But it's not enough just to sing with passion, Ava. You need to maintain that control. Opera is about sustaining power without losing precision." Ava nodded, hope flickering in her chest. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was something. And right now, that was enough. Miss Hodge turned away, returning to her desk. "The showcase is in 2 weeks. If you're serious about proving yourself, I suggest you use that time wisely." Ava's heart soared. She had a chance. It wasn't guaranteed, and it wasn't going to be easy, but she had been given the one thing she had been fighting for, an opportunity. She left the room with her head held high, her mind already racing with plans. 2 weeks. That was all the time she had to prepare, to refine her performance, to prove that she belonged on that stage. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her mother's legacy, for every dream that had been deferred, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Miss Hodge, stand in her way. The weight of the melody. The 2 weeks leading up to the spring showcase was some of the longest, hardest, and most intense days of Ava's life. But they were also the most transformative. From the moment Miss Hodge had given her a second chance, Ava had known that she couldn't waste a single minute. This wasn't just about proving her worth as a singer. This was about standing her ground in a world that didn't always make space for people like her. The next morning after her conversation with Miss Hodge, Ava woke up before dawn. As the sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, Ava was already practicing. The familiar hum of her mother's old record player filled the living room as she worked through arias, her voice rising and falling in harmony with the music. She had turned their small living room into her own rehearsal space. The furniture was pushed aside, and her sheet music was spread across the coffee table. Every spare moment was spent fine-tuning her performance, correcting every little mistake, perfecting every breath. Her father, Darius, supported her in every way he could. He would listen to her practice, offer encouragement, and even attempt to learn a few Italian phrases just so he could understand what she was singing. His pride in her was evident, but he also knew that this was a battle only Ava could fight. No one could win this for her, not even him. Still, as proud as Darius was, Ava could sense the worry in his eyes. He had seen his wife's dreams crushed under the weight of a world that refused to let her shine. And now he feared that the same thing might happen to his daughter. But Ava was determined to show him, and the world, that she was strong enough to break through. At school, things weren't much easier. Word had gotten around about Ava's confrontation with Miss Hodge, and her classmates began to take notice. Some were curious, others indifferent, but a few were quietly resentful. Elena Carter, in particular, seemed less than thrilled that Ava had been given a second chance. It wasn't that Elena was a bad person. In fact, she had always been polite and friendly to Ava, at least on the surface. But now there was a coldness in her gaze whenever their paths crossed. Elena had been Miss Hodge's top choice for the solo, and Ava's re-entry into the competition clearly made her uncomfortable. One afternoon, Ava was heading toward the music room for another solo rehearsal when Elena caught up to her in the hallway. "Hey, Ava," Elena called, her voice smooth and casual. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Ava slowed her pace and turned to face her. Elena's blonde hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, and she wore the kind of effortless confidence that came with being Crestville royalty. But there was something behind her smile, something that made Ava's gut tighten. "Sure," Ava replied, though her voice was wary. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice as if they were sharing a secret. "I just wanted to say that it's great that Miss Hodge is giving you another shot. Really, it is. But you know how competitive the showcase is, right?" Ava raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, unaware." Elena's smile tightened. "It's just, opera isn't easy. You're really good at the stuff you sing, but opera, it takes years of training. I don't want you to get your hopes up and then get disappointed." Ava's heart clenched. She knew what Elena was trying to say without saying it. She was trying to plant doubt, trying to remind Ava that she didn't belong in the world of classical music. But instead of shrinking back, Ava stood taller. She met Elena's gaze head-on, her voice steady. "Thanks for the concern, Elena. But I know what I'm doing, and I'm ready for this." Elena's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Of course. Well, good luck." Ava watched as Elena walked away, her spine rigid with determination. She knew what Elena was trying to do, make her doubt herself, make her second-guess her abilities. But Ava wouldn't let it work. She had faced worse than this, and she wasn't about to let some thinly veiled attempt at sabotage derail her. In the weeks leading up to the showcase, Ava's life became a blur of rehearsals, schoolwork, and late-night sessions in the living room, where her father would sit in his recliner, listening quietly as she practiced. One evening, as she was running through her aria for what felt like the 100th time, Darius interrupted her, his deep voice cutting through the music. "Ava," he said, "come sit for a minute." Ava paused, her breath still coming in short gasps from the effort of singing. She walked over to the couch and sank down beside her father, wiping a sheen of sweat from her forehead. "You're working yourself too hard," Darius said, his voice soft with concern. "You've been practicing non-stop, but you're wearing yourself out. You need to rest." Ava shook her head, her jaw set. "I can't, Dad. The showcase is almost here. I have to be perfect." Darius studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Baby girl, you're already perfect. But you need to remember something. Your voice is powerful because of who you are, not just because of how hard you work. Don't lose that fire by burning yourself out." Ava looked down at her hands, her throat tightening. She knew he was right, but the pressure felt overwhelming. She had to prove herself, not just to Miss Hodge, but to everyone who had ever doubted her, everyone who had ever told her that she didn't belong. "I just want to be ready," Ava said quietly. "You are ready," Darius replied, his voice full of quiet conviction. "And whatever happens, you've already made me, and your mother, proud." Ava felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't let herself cry now. Not yet. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. As the day of the showcase drew closer, the tension at school grew thicker. Every hallway conversation seemed to be about the upcoming performances, who would steal the show, and who might crumble under the pressure. Ava felt the weight of every glance, every whisper, but she refused to let it shake her focus. In the final week leading up to the showcase, Miss Hodge called a special rehearsal for the soloists. Ava arrived early, hoping to get a few extra minutes of warm-up time. When she entered the music room, she found Elena already there, standing by the piano with a look of pure determination on her face. Miss Hodge was seated at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. She glanced up when she saw Ava, but her expression remained neutral. "You're early," she said simply. Ava nodded, her throat tight. She was always early now. Every minute counted. Miss Hodge motioned for her to take a seat. "We'll begin shortly. I want to run through Elena's piece first." Ava sat down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she watched Elena step forward. The room fell silent as Elena began to sing, her voice effortlessly gliding through the notes of her aria. It was beautiful, flawless even. But as Ava listened, she realized something. There was no heart in it. Elena's voice was technically perfect, but it lacked the raw emotion that Ava knew was her strength. The kind of emotion that came from a place deep inside, from a life lived with struggle and perseverance. When Elena finished, Miss Hodge offered a small nod of approval. "Very good, Elena. Your technique has improved." Elena smiled, but Ava could see the strain in her expression. Elena was used to being the best, and the competition was clearly starting to wear on her. Then it was Ava's turn. She stood, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked to the front of the room. The piano's ivory keys gleamed under the soft light, and the familiar tension in her muscles returned as she prepared to sing. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let the music take over. This time, Ava didn't think about Miss Hodge or Elena or the showcase. She didn't think about the pressure or the expectations. She just sang. Her voice poured out of her like a river, flowing with all the passion, pain, and joy she had held inside. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling a story. Her story. The story of her mother, her father, and every dream she had ever dared to chase. When she finished, the room was silent. She opened her eyes, her chest heaving, and saw that Miss Hodge was staring at her with an expression Ava had never seen before, something close to surprise, maybe even admiration. Miss Hodge cleared her throat. "That was, well done, Ava." Ava's heart leaped in her chest. It wasn't high praise, but coming from Miss Hodge, it was more than she had ever expected. She had done it. She had shown Miss Hodge, shown herself, that she belonged. As she stepped down from the front of the room, she caught Elena's gaze. There was no smile on her face this time, only a tight, cold expression that made Ava's stomach churn. But she pushed a feeling aside. She had her own journey to focus on now. The final note. The day of the spring showcase arrived with an air of quiet tension that seemed to ripple through the halls of Crestville's Rosewood High School. For most students, it was just another school day, but for Ava, it was the day she had been preparing for with every ounce of strength and determination she possessed. It was the culmination of weeks of practice, late nights, and pushing herself far beyond the limits she had thought possible. Today, she would prove not just to Miss Hodge, but to herself that she belonged on that stage. Ava had arrived early that morning, long before the school doors officially opened. The sky was still tinged with the deep purples and blues of dawn as she stood outside the auditorium, clutching her sheet music in one hand and her breath steadying with each exhale. The air was cool, almost refreshing, and it helped calm her racing thoughts. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle around her. The quiet was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the past few weeks. Her mind replayed the countless hours she had spent practicing, the times she had doubted herself, and the words of encouragement from her father that had always been a balm to her fears. "You've already made me proud," he had said. "Now go make yourself proud too." Ava felt a warmth in her chest at the memory. She wasn't doing this just for her father or for the memory of her mother. She was doing this for herself. She deserved to be here, and today was her chance to show everyone that. As the doors to the auditorium opened and other students began to file in, Ava slipped inside, heading toward the backstage area where performers were already bustling around, preparing for their moments in the spotlight. Some of them looked nervous, pacing back and forth, while others exuded a quiet confidence that only fueled Ava's determination. She found a quiet corner to warm up her voice, gently humming through her scales and breathing deeply to calm her nerves. She could hear the low hum of chatter from the auditorium as more students, teachers, and parents arrived to watch the performance. Among them, Ava knew, was Ms. Hodge. The thought sent a flutter of anxiety through her stomach, but she pushed it down. Miss Hodge might have doubted her, but Ava wasn't performing for her approval. She was performing because she had earned this. As she continued her warm-up, Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a text from her father. "Dorius, I'm in the audience, baby girl, right up front. I'll be cheering you on the whole way." Ava smiled, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Knowing her father was there made the moment feel even more real, even more important. She quickly typed back, "Ava, thanks, Dad. I'll give them everything I've got." She tucked her phone away and glanced at the program, running her fingers over the glossy paper. Her name was there, listed among the soloists, right under Elena Carter's. The sight of it was enough to send a fresh wave of determination coursing through her veins. The showcase began with a quiet sense of grandeur, the lights dimming in the packed auditorium as the audience hushed in anticipation. The first performers took the stage with well-rehearsed confidence. Each act met with polite applause and murmurs of approval. The school's string quartet performed an intricate piece, followed by a modern dance number that had the audience on the edge of their seats. Ava stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest as the moments ticked by, bringing her closer to her performance. She peeked out from behind the heavy velvet curtain, scanning the crowd for her father. He was easy to spot, sitting near the front, his broad shoulders making him stand out among the other parents. His presence was steady, grounding, and it filled Ava with the strength she needed. Then came Elena Carter's turn. Ava watched as Elena strode onto the stage with the effortless grace of someone born to perform. Her hair was swept back in an elegant updo, and her sleek black dress shimmered under the stage lights. She looked every bit the part of a classical opera star. Elena began her aria, her voice soaring over the audience, filling the room with flawless, crystalline notes. It was beautiful, there was no denying that. But as Ava watched, she couldn't help but notice the mechanical precision in Elena's performance. It was perfect, yes, but it was also cold, devoid of the raw emotion that Ava knew she could bring. Elena's aria came to a close, and the audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Ava clapped along with them, her heart racing, knowing that her turn was next. As Elena left the stage, their eyes met for a brief moment. Elena's expression was tight, her smile strained. Ava could see the flicker of tension behind her eyes, as though she knew the competition was far from over. The moment finally arrived. Ava's name was called, and the stage manager gestured for her to step forward. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak. This was it. All the weeks of preparation, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, everything had led to this. She walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment as she stood at the center. The audience was a blur of faces, but she didn't need to see them to know they were watching. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting, expecting. The accompanist at the piano began to play, the soft, lilting melody filling the auditorium. Ava closed her eyes for just a moment, grounding herself in the music, in the rhythm of her breath. And then, with a deep inhale, she began to sing. Her voice started soft, almost a whisper, but with each note, it grew stronger, richer, filling the space around her. Ava didn't just sing the notes, she lived them. Every word, every rise and fall in the melody was infused with the depth of her emotion, the weight of her journey. She sang not just for the audience, but for herself, for her mother, for every dream she had ever dared to hold close. The song's crescendo came, and Ava hit the high note with precision and power, her voice soaring over the audience like a bird in flight. She could feel the energy in the room shift as the audience leaned in, captivated by the raw beauty of the performance. For those few minutes, there was nothing but the music and her voice, unapologetically strong, undeniably present. When the final note fell, the room was silent. Ava stood there, her heart pounding in the stillness. She opened her eyes to see the faces of the audience staring back at her, wide-eyed and silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And then slowly, the applause began. It started as a ripple, a few claps here and there, but soon it swelled into a thunderous wave, echoing through the auditorium. The sound washed over Ava, filling her with a sense of triumph she had never known before. This was what she had worked for. This was what she had fought for. As she stood on that stage, the applause ringing in her ears, she caught sight of Miss Hodge in the audience. The older woman's face was unreadable, her expression neither disapproving nor approving. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of acknowledgement, that Ava hadn't seen before. Miss Hodge didn't have to say a word. Ava knew what it meant. Backstage, the rush of the performance still coursed through Ava's veins as she stepped off the stage. She was breathless, exhilarated, but most of all, she felt free. She had done it. She had stood her ground, fought for her place, and delivered a performance that was hers, and hers alone. As she made her way through the backstage area, the other performers offered her quiet congratulations, nods of respect that hadn't been there before. Even Elena, though still reserved, gave her a small, tight smile as she passed. Ava didn't need anything more. She knew she had earned it. But the most important moment came when she stepped out into the lobby of the auditorium and saw her father waiting for her. Darius stood there, a proud smile on his face, his eyes shining with emotion. He opened his arms, and Ava didn't hesitate. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around him as he lifted her off the ground in a bear hug. "You did it, baby girl," Darius whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You really did it." Ava clung to him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of joy, of relief, of triumph. She had done it. She had broken through. As they stood there, father and daughter, the world outside the auditorium seemed distant, almost unimportant, because in that moment, Ava knew that she had found her voice, and nothing, not even Miss Hodge, could ever take that away from her again. The sound of freedom. The applause had long faded, the lights dimmed, and the auditorium emptied, but the echoes of Ava's performance still lingered in the air, as if her voice had imprinted itself on the very walls of Rosewood High's stage. She had left it all there, her doubts, her fears, her pain, and her triumph, and now that it was over, Ava felt lighter than she had in months. The following day dawned bright and crisp, with the sunlight filtering through the small window in her bedroom. Ava lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet of the morning settle around her. It felt different now. The world had shifted in some subtle yet profound way. She had done what she had set out to do. She had claimed her space, used her voice, and no one, not even Miss Hodge, could silence her anymore. As she slowly got out of bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up and saw a message from Elena Carter, the last person she expected to hear from. "Elena, hey, I know this is a little late, but I wanted to say congrats. You really killed it last night, and you were right to fight for your place. I'm glad you did." Ava stared at the screen, her heart softening as she read the message. She hadn't been looking for Elena's approval, but seeing those words made her realize something important. It wasn't about being the best or being chosen by Miss Hodge. It was about standing up for herself, about refusing to let anyone, even someone like Elena, dictate where she belonged. She quickly typed a reply. "Ava, thank you, Elena. That means a lot. And for what it's worth, you were amazing too." Ava set the phone down and smiled to herself. That simple exchange felt like a closing of a chapter, a moment of quiet resolution between them. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone anymore, not to Miss Hodge, not to Elena, and not even to the school that had often made her feel like she didn't belong. Later that afternoon, Ava walked into the music room for the first time since the showcase. The room felt different now, not the battlefield it once was, but more like a familiar space where she'd have fought her hardest and emerged victorious. She half expected to feel the old tension in the air, but instead she felt nothing but peace. Miss Hodge was already there, seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The older woman looked up when Ava entered, her sharp gaze softened just a touch. There was a long moment of silence as they regarded each other, the tension of the past weeks now replaced by something closer to understanding. "Ava," Miss Hodge said, her voice steady but without the usual edge, "I wanted to speak with you before you left today." Ava took a deep breath, walking further into the room. "Okay." Miss Hodge gestured for her to sit in the front row, and Ava complied, her heart beating steadily as she waited. For the first time, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't anxious about what Miss Hodge might say. She had already proven what she needed to prove. Miss Hodge folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. "You've come a long way since the first time you auditioned," she began, her voice measured. "And I'll be honest with you, Ava, I wasn't sure you could do it. Opera isn't easy. It requires more than just raw talent, as I've told you before. But what I didn't take into account was your persistence, your refusal to give up." Ava didn't say anything. She just listened, waiting to hear where this was going. Miss Hodge sighed softly, and for the first time, she seemed to let her guard down just a little. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I've seen many students come and go. Many with talent, many without. But very few have had what you have, Ava." She paused, meeting Ava's eyes. "You have heart. And that's something no amount of technical training can teach." Ava blinked, taken aback by the unexpected compliment. She had spent so long trying to gain Miss Hodge's approval, and now here it was, offered freely, without pretense. "I know I push you hard," Miss Hodge continued, her tone softening. "Perhaps harder than I should have. But I did it because I wanted to see if you had the strength to push back, to keep going when it felt like the odds were against you. And you did." Ava's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I did it because I knew I belonged on that stage. I had to prove that to you, to everyone, but mostly to myself." Miss Hodge nodded slowly, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "You did, and I want you to know that I'm proud of what you accomplished." The words hit Ava with more force than she expected. All those weeks of tension, of feeling dismissed and unworthy, seemed to dissolve in the wake of Miss Hodge's admission. It didn't erase the past, but it gave Ava something she hadn't realized she needed: acknowledgement, a recognition of her talent, not just from her family or friends, but from someone who had doubted her from the beginning. "Thank you," Ava said quietly, feeling a weight lift off her chest. Miss Hodge offered a small, tight-lipped smile. "You're welcome, but don't think for a second that this is the end of the road. If anything, this is just the beginning. You have a gift, Ava. Don't waste it." Ava smiled, a new sense of confidence blooming in her chest. "I won't." That evening, Ava sat with her father on the front porch, the sun setting low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. They sat in comfortable silence, Darius sipping his coffee while Ava absent-mindedly flicked through a music magazine she had borrowed from the school library. "So," Darius said after a long stretch of quiet, "what's next for you, baby girl? You've proven yourself at the showcase, but I know that mind of yours is already working on the next big thing." Ava laughed softly, setting the magazine down. "You know me too well, Dad." "Darn right I do," he said, grinning. "So, what's on your mind?" Ava leaned back in her chair, staring up at the sky, the colors of the sunset reminding her of the stage lights that had shone down on her the night before. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something big, something that had been waiting for her all along, but that she had only now truly begun to see. "I'm not sure exactly," she admitted, "but I know that I want to keep singing. And not just at school. I want to take it further. Maybe apply for some summer programs, look into auditions outside of Crestville." Darius nodded approvingly, pride shining in his eyes. "That sounds like a plan. Your mama would have been all over that idea." Ava smiled, her heart warming at the mention of her mother. She still carried her mother's voice with her, but it no longer felt like a burden or an expectation. It felt like a legacy she could choose to honor in her own way. "You think I'm ready?" she asked, more for reassurance than anything else. Darius chuckled, reaching over to gently tap her on the shoulder. "Ava, you were born ready. You've been proving it every day. Now it's just time to take that next step." Ava nodded, the fear and doubt that had once gripped her heart now replaced by something stronger. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Pursuing music never was. But she also knew that she had what it took to fight for her place in the world, to carve out a space where her voice could be heard, loud and clear. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ava closed her eyes and listened to the quiet hum of the evening. It was a new kind of silence, not the suffocating silence of doubt and fear, but the peaceful quiet that came after a hard-fought battle. And in that silence, Ava felt free. Epilogue: The Voice That Soars. A few months later, the letters started arriving. Ava had applied to several summer music programs, each one more prestigious than the last. The process had been grueling, with applications, recordings, and auditions, but she had done it with the same determination that had carried her through the showcase. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew that if she didn't try, she would never know what was possible. The first letter was from a well-known conservatory in New York. Ava's hands shook as she tore open the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the page, and then, in bold letters, she saw the words, "Congratulations, you've been accepted." Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a wide smile breaking across her face. She had done it. She was going to New York. Months after the spring showcase, Ava stood on a different stage, far from Crestville, far from the small-town world she had once known. The lights were just as bright, the audience just as captivated, but this time, Ava felt more at home than ever. She had earned her place here, not because of anyone else's approval, but because she'd have fought for it. And now, her voice would be heard by the world. As the first notes of her performance filled the air, Ava smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. The end.